Okay, so we're going to do our first panel. So if the first panel, which is stabilize and support renters, wants to start making their way up here, I'm going to read the problem statement and the vision statement for this panel. So our problem statement for the panel on stabilize and support renters is this. Fayetteville renters are facing a growing crisis. Rising rents, weak protections, low vacancy rates, and few emergency assistance options are making it harder to stay housed. And the vision statement, what we hope for. Fayetteville renters feel stable, supported, and rooted in community. Okay, so I want to welcome our first moderator, Bobby Howard from Arkansas Appleseed's Legal Justice Center, along with our panelists. Y'all can make your way to the front. Give them a round of applause. Unfortunately, Shonda from the Fayetteville Housing Authority isn't able to join us, but we do get to hear from Thelishia Conley, who is a graduated circle leader from Cohort 2 and a new tenant in the Cobblestone Affordable Housing Complex off of Weddington. So we're really excited to have all of our panelists and our moderator here. Panelists, you might have to hold the button to make sure you get green at the top, or push the slidey thing. Okay, and make sure you talk into the mic.
Thank you all so much for coming here. Just real quick, I want to honor the Circle staff. If you're on staff, can you wave your hand? They worked so hard to put this event together. Great job. I also want to thank the City of Fayetteville for being really great partners to organizations like Circles to figure out these big problems for the people of Fayetteville. So if you're with the city, thank you for everything you're doing to tackle this issue as well. So panel, we're here to discuss stability, housing stability for renters. Most of us who are here are already familiar with the big set of problems that is housing affordability and housing stability in Fayetteville, from rising rents to rising everything else, to limited legal protections for renters, to a hollowed out social safety net at the state level. All of these things together are really pressing families in Fayetteville and making it hard to afford to live in Fayetteville. We're going to talk about those problems on this panel, but we're also going to talk about opportunities. We're going to talk about solutions, and that's why this group of panelists has been assembled, because they're the ones that you need to listen to, but they know stuff about housing. All right, I'm just here to ask questions and keep trains on the track. So let's just jump right in so y'all have time to answer the questions. We're just going to go in this direction, starting with Billy. Billy, could you introduce yourself and your organization, and then give us an idea, just pretty briefly, of how this housing affordability issue or housing stability issue shows up in your daily work and in the lives of the people that you serve.
Absolutely. Thank you. Hello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Billy Cook. I'm an organizer with Arkansas Renters United and Arkansas Community Organizations. We are an anti-poverty group based right here in the Natural State, dedicated to community organizing, mainly low and middle income Arkansans, in order to advocate for issues related to affordable housing, health care, and other community concerns. I would like to answer the second half of that question with a story. I was recently put in contact with a lady named Helen, a senior in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, so about 45 minutes west of here. Her rent has recently been raised from $750 to $1,150. And you see instances like that, not just in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, but also in the city of Fayetteville, because Arkansas law has no regulations on how rent can be capped year over year. And so it's stories like that that you deal with a lot of the time, and people come to you when their rent gets increased, or they have mold, or they're living with mice, or whatever it might be. And as you said earlier, the lack of a safety net really creates a problem for people. And even if you can direct them to the limited resources that exist, that is just a 1-month Band-Aid, whereas we have systemic issues that need to find ways to pay the rent every month.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm Thelishia Conley. I was a circle leader in Cohort 2, and I'm now part of VOIS, and I'm from Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm Britin Bostick. Oh, it says green.
I think you're good.
It's on. I'm Britin Bostick. I'm a long-range planner for the city of Fayetteville, and I am a co-author of our annual housing assessment that we put out in 2023, and we're a little bit into 2025, so it's almost annual, but I try to think about it as an annual report And so a lot of my work around housing is the data of housing in Fayetteville and Northwest Arkansas. And something that I see a lot of is how many people in our community are not able to attain housing. Exactly what my fellow panelists are saying, but I'm seeing it in the data, and so we're able to put quantities to that. It can feel like a very dehumanizing thing to talk about people in terms of data and numbers, and so what I try to do is connect these stories and lived experiences to the data that we're seeing, so that it's not just a set of numbers. These are people that we're talking about. And it's really important, I think, from an advocacy point of view and also from a solutions point of view, to be able to have some of those more concrete numbers to say, here's the scale of the problem. When you have over 18,000 households in Fayetteville as of 2 years ago not able to afford housing, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their household income on housing, when we say crisis, that's what we're talking about. And when we see that a very, very high proportion of our folks who cannot afford housing are specifically renters, and renters making less than $50,000 a year, we can begin to identify where the most critical solutions can live, or where those most critical solutions need to be deployed. And so a lot of my role and a lot of what I can provide is data around housing. I also look at our housing production on a monthly basis. So I look at both our population growth and how much housing we're producing and what kind. And I'm able to speak to things like the assumption that it's a simple supply-demand equation. Have y'all heard this? People say, oh, we'll just build more housing and then it won't be such a problem. That would be true if the equation were a simple equation, but it's a very complex equation. So if we're building more housing, but the housing that we're building is so far out of reach of most of the people who need housing, supply demand in a very simple equation is not going to be a solution, because we need to provide housing where we have the highest demand, which is well below where the market is producing housing. So I try to give language to that and make sure that we're providing clarity and transparency, so again, we can solution around very specific problems, not think that a very simple solution is going to be able to do anything to move the needle on where our community needs it.
Go ahead, Konrad.
My name's Conrad Siemek. I'm with AD&U. We do kind of infill development, small scale development, mostly just here in Fayetteville. So we've been working with my partner Wes on doing kind of some smaller lots, kind of focused on infill housing and more attainable housing for first-time homeowners. I'm also a landlord, and so I think I've heard lots of stories from tenants of mine about housing affordability. We've inspected a lot of homes where folks are living in kind of not so great conditions, where their utility costs are just really substantial. And so that's been kind of a lot of my experience as a landlord in the housing affordability realm.
Awesome. Thank you, panelists. Britin, can we start with you? I got a question for you. All right. What levers does the city of Fayetteville actually have to stabilize renters, given that housing policy is so happens at the state level so often?
This is a really good question. So I'll go back to what I said a moment ago about housing supply. Fayetteville has been growing by roughly 2,200 people per year, and it's easy to say, oh, that's all the students. We have a lot of students, don't get me wrong, but that is not necessarily the student population. And so if you think about our population growth, it's a lot of non-students. So people who are here 12 months out of the year, not just 9 months out of the year. And all of those folks who are moving here are seeking housing, right? So the more people we have, the more housing demand we have. And one of the things that the city has a very active role in is housing supply. How much housing are we able to produce to keep up with that demand? From 2019 to 2024, we were behind our demand. So we had more people moving to Fayetteville than we had housing being created in Fayetteville. And I'm really proud to say that we've started to catch up on that. We're producing as much housing as we would need to keep up with population growth. But all that can do is start to stabilize housing costs. But again, that's only for part of our population's housing needs, because we're not building housing and we're not supplying housing where our greatest demand is, and that's for lower income households. So one of the things that you can look at as far as the city's responsibility is, are we making sure though that we're not getting further behind because we're producing housing really consistently and we're keeping up with population growth? I don't think that that means that we have to produce housing at any cost, because there are long-term consequences that some of our community members are the least able to bear. So as you're talking about inspecting housing that is in not very good condition, I don't think that housing at any cost is also a solution, but we have a very active role in housing supply, where I think we can also have a very active role, and I'm really excited to see my colleagues pulling together economic development in hosting this event, is we're looking to deploy the resources that we do have the most effectively. So we are a recipient of federal funds. How are those federal funds spent? We are able to provide great partnerships. How are we leveraging those partnerships for successful outcomes? There is a real advantage to being a municipal organization. We are a municipal government of a city of just over 100,000 people. So we can provide resources at a scale that even most nonprofits cannot. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that the city has some limitations on it, but the scale at which we can deploy resources is beyond the private and philanthropic sector in most cases. So how can the city be aware of the resources and the capabilities we have at a scale that outsizes the private sector and deploy those resources on behalf of our community members that need it the most? And so I've been really excited to see how many, kind of going beyond discussion, but how many partnerships have been created to make that happen. And so one of our recent partnerships that I've been really excited about is with the Fayetteville Housing Authority, which I think is stepping into being able to fulfill the role that we need them to step into. And so they're very actively looking at solutions that get them in the game of building the housing that we need that is not a market side solution. There are not really big incentives to build very low cost housing or to retain very low cost housing. But if you think about one of the reasons that people's rent goes up, it's property taxes. You may have heard this, right? So if landlords are facing a property tax increase, they want to pass that on to their tenants. So then your tenants don't know year to year how they're going to be impacted, how their rent will be impacted by property tax increases. Well, guess who doesn't pay property taxes on their property? The city of Fayetteville. So if the city owns property and that property is not subject to property taxes, how can that be a potential solution for the stabilization of rents? We have other property owning entities like the Fayetteville Housing Authority, again, who are not paying property taxes. Our churches are not paying property taxes. So as we think about solutions, I think we can also think about very specific ways that people can help provide stability because they themselves are in a more stable position. And one of the first things I thought about was, how do property taxes play a role in rents going up? And who wouldn't be subject to that? So how can that be part of the solution? And that's usually not available through the private sector, right? Because there's different rules for the private sector than sometimes we have.
That was great, thanks. Konrad, I heard Britin say that these upward price pressures aren't just about a lack of supply, it's a lack of supply of the right kind of housing to meet the most demand, the affordable housing. Can you speak to some of the barriers that developers or landlords face in providing more affordable, stable housing?
Yeah, so I think Britin touched on some of that. You know, the answers you typically hear are acquisition costs for land, property tax, insurance, interest rates, obviously recently. I think that, you know, that makes things a lot more complex, and also makes development decisions really maximalist. So in order to overcome those things, people may scrape a perfectly good house that's already on a property and build the biggest thing they can in that area, or build the most profitable thing they can, aka kind of like the student housing, you know, that we're kind of seeing, the purpose-built student housing that is necessarily down the road maybe not that easy to adaptively reduce and turn into other kinds of housing. It's kind of hard to, you know, 4 bedrooms with maybe different separate bathrooms and a kitchen, it's hard to kind of take that unless you do like a co-housing kind of thing, which is becoming popular, but I don't know, the demand for that is probably kind of limited, I'd imagine. So another issue is kind of like NIMBYism. If you want to do really neat things in a residential neighborhood that has, mature trees and mature homes, and you want to do gentle infill, but your neighbors don't want you to, then, you can't. And then you're kind of tempted to scrape down the house and, again, build something that's maximal. But allowing ADUs or lot splits, allowing those sorts of things, I think, is one of the main solutions to that. This is an odd one I kind of came up with, but like complexities of remodels. I don't know what the answer to this is other than just teaching more people how to remodel houses, but a lot of people don't want to go through the remodel process. I've remodeled a lot of homes over the years, and it's very challenging. It takes a lot of time and effort and a lot of knowledge and a lot of risk. And so instead of just trying to remodel a house that's perfectly good, or you're not perfectly good, but needs a ton of work, people would rather just scrape it, right? It's so much easier to manage subs in the construction process when you're starting from ground zero and you're building up from there. So I think that's one of the barriers as well. ADU financing is a really large barrier, and there's efforts to change that, but Britin probably knows a lot more about that than I do, but it's still a huge issue. You have to have a lot of equity in your home in order to pull it off, or you just have to have a lot of cash. Or that's pretty much, those are the main ways. So some solutions to that would be like, utility easements versus deeded access for utilities. So we run into this a lot in the city of, you get to unlock a lot more land that you can build smaller homes and sell to people who can get 30-year mortgages. If you allow sewer and water to enter that property via an easement rather than deeded access. Having deeded strips of land really restricts your ability to do infill housing at scale at times. The city's made a lot of really neat improvements to their to just the development process lately, more staff, streamlining processes. So I think all that really helps. There's some new AD&U laws from the state that will cap application fees at like $250. And so a lot of those kind of measures I think are really positive.
Awesome. Thanks, Konrad. We're going to pivot just a little bit to the experiences that many renters in Fayetteville are having. So for those of you who don't know, Cobblestone is a relatively new affordable housing complex that utilized land donated by a church in the low-income housing tax credits to keep rent affordable. And Thelishia is a new resident at Cobblestone, which is really exciting. Can you talk some to what being a renter in Fayetteville was like before Cobblestone, and then maybe how moving into Cobblestone has changed things for your family and your finances?
Yes, so before the place that I lived at before I moved to Cobblestone, I lived there for 8 years. Over that time, my rent, it increased and increased and increased. And eventually I was paying double of what, I had 3 or 4 different owners, and then by the 4th year of me living there, my rent was increasing significantly. By the time I moved out, I was paying double of what I had originally paid, which wouldn't be an issue, but my landlord did not want to fix anything, and there were so many things that was wrong with the property. It's 30 years old, and it hadn't been, I lived there for 8 years, and it hadn't been fixed at all the entire time. What I was going to say, I'm sorry. With the increase of rent, my income wasn't increasing. So therefore, there were months where I'm a mom of 2. So there was months where I would have to choose between buying diapers, or paying a bill, or paying rent late. My landlord at that time, she didn't care, I want to say. So I would have to pay late fees, and I'm okay, that's fine. But then if I had say my rent, I had the rent money, but I didn't have what the late fees had. I can't think of the word. what the late fees added up to. I was paying like late fees on top of like late fees for my late fees, basically, and so which was putting me further behind. I don't know, which is something that I think that people in different tax brackets, like higher tax brackets, doesn't realize that, I mean, we don't purposely not want to pay rent. Things just happen. Or like if one of my kids got sick, you know, I'd have to miss work. So then that would mess with my income as well. I don't know, I would say overall the experience living there, like yes, I was grateful to have like a roof over my children's head and my head, but it was not the best, not the best experience.
Can you talk some about the transition over to cobblestone and how that's changed things?
Nice. That transition, I moved in April. I had been on the wait list for a while, finally got approved, got moved in. That has been life-changing. What I was paying in rent at my previous place is basically what I pay now for like rent, utilities, gas, everything except for food. So that has helped. So like basically my rent now is pretty much half of what my rent was before. And that has allowed me to be able to save money, not have to like stress about how I'm gonna pay this bill or that bill. I'd never been able to take my kids on vacation before. We were able to go to the beach this summer. I live in the neighborhood I live in, you know, like my best friend lives next door. My cousin lives across the street. I have another cousin around the corner. And it's just been nice for all of us. Our kids are able to play outside. It's a decent neighborhood, whereas before, you know, it's kind of sketchy. And I don't know, it's just nice to be able to have that financial stability. So like, even if just recently I had to miss work, but with me missing work, I didn't have to think like, oh great, now that I miss work, how am I gonna have to pay this? Like, how am I gonna be able to pay rent because my check is short? Or how am I gonna be able to pay a utility or buy food or whatever, just because it's affordable? And I don't know, really thankful and grateful. My kids love it, and everybody else over there that I know loves it. And it just gives that leeway of, you know, being able to, your income increasing, and we're able to save, we're able to do things that we've worked so hard to be able to do that we weren't able to do because our wages weren't going up, but the rent was increasing. So